is of the stone house. The Vosges mountains stretched into morning fog like broken teeth, each ridge carved raw by winter and war. Lieutenant Audie Murphy pressed his back against the cold stone of what had once been a French farmhouse, watching his breath cloud in the January air as artillery rumbled somewhere beyond the tree line. The 3rd Infantry Division had been grinding through these frozen forests for weeks, taking ridges and roads one bloody yard at a time, and this crossroads was supposed to be just another waypoint on the march toward Germany. But the disabled Sherman tank blocking the road ahead told a different story. Murphy counted 8 men left in his squad, their faces grey with exhaustion and the particular pallor that came from too many close calls. Sergeant Hayes crouched beside the tank's twisted tracks, his rifle trained on the woods where German voices had been echoing for the past hour. The radio crackled with static and distant reports. Route Zebra compromised. All units fall back to secondary positions immediately. Murphy stared at the farmhouse 60 yards ahead, its stone walls pocked with bullet holes, but still standing solid against the winter sky. According to the map, taking that crossroads would anchor the entire sector. In German hands, it would cut off 2 companies of American infantry moving through the parallel valleys. The mathematics of war were brutal and simple. Retreat now, and more men would die later, when they had to take this same ground again. "We gotta move," Lieutenant Hayes whispered, his voice tight. "That house ain't worth dying for." Murphy studied the farmhouse again, noting the thick walls and commanding view of the road junction. 24 hours ago, this had been listed as a routine objective. Light resistance, maybe a few scattered sentries. Nobody had mentioned the full German patrol that had moved in during the night, or the machine gun nests they'd positioned in the forest edge. Intelligence was always perfect on paper and always wrong on the ground. The fog began to lift, revealing the true scope of their predicament. German soldiers moved between the pine trees with practiced efficiency, at least 20 of them that Murphy could count. His own squad was down to 8, after Jenkins took shrapnel from the first mortar round. Kowalski, their medic, was doing what he could, but Jenkins needed real medical attention soon. The jeep that was supposed to evacuate casualties now sat as a twisted wreck 50 yards behind them, blocking their retreat route and burning black smoke into the winter air. Murphy pulled out the letter he'd been carrying since they left the rest position 3 days ago. His sister's handwriting looked strange here in the Vosges mountains, all neat loops and careful words about home and weather and small-town news that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. He folded it carefully and tucked it back into his jacket pocket, next to the weight of the responsibility that never seemed to leave his chest. The disabled Sherman's main gun pointed uselessly at the sky, but Murphy could see that its machine guns were still operational. If someone could reach that farmhouse and establish a firing position, they might be able to lay down enough covering fire for the squad to work around the German flank. It was the kind of plan that looked reasonable on paper and felt like suicide when you were the one who had to cross 60 yards of open ground under fire. Through his binoculars, Murphy studied the German positions. They'd been smart about it, using the natural cover of the forest and the stone outbuildings to create interlocking fields of fire. Anyone advancing on the farmhouse would be caught in a crossfire from at least 3 directions. It was a textbook defensive setup, the kind they'd studied at Fort Benning, back when the war was still something that happened to other people in distant places. "Radio's still dead," reported Private Morrison, the youngest man in the squad at 19. His hands shook slightly as he worked the dials, whether from cold or fear, Murphy couldn't tell. "Can't raise company headquarters or anybody else?" Murphy watched Morrison's face, seeing his own reflection from 2 years ago, when he'd been the new replacement trying to prove himself worthy of the men around him. The Vosges mountains had a way of aging soldiers fast, turning boys into veterans in the space of a single firefight. Morrison was learning what they all had to learn eventually, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what needed doing even when your hands wouldn't stop shaking. The German voices grew louder, coordinating something in the tree line. Murphy recognized the cadence of tactical communication, the same urgent efficiency he heard in American units preparing for an assault. Time was running out. In minutes, his squad would be completely surrounded, cut off from any hope of reaching friendly lines. The farmhouse that had seemed like just another objective on the morning briefing map now looked like their only chance of survival. Murphy closed his eyes and tried to picture the tactical situation from above, the way the instructors had taught him to think about terrain and movement. Roads, ridges, fields of fire, cover and concealment. But what the manuals never mentioned was how it felt to know that 8 men were counting on you to make the right decision, and that the wrong choice would get them all killed in a foreign forest whose name they couldn't even pronounce correctly. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The plan that formed in Murphy's mind was less strategy than controlled desperation. Through the lifting fog, he could see the stone farmhouse more clearly now. 2 stories, thick walls that would stop rifle fire, and windows that commanded the entire road junction. The German patrol had been using it as an observation post, which meant they knew its tactical value as well as he did. Getting there would mean crossing open ground under fire. Holding it would mean fighting room to room against superior numbers. "Give me 3 minutes, then lay down covering fire with that .30 caliber, Murphy told Hayes, nodding toward the disabled Sherman. "Keep their heads down while I work my way to the house." Hayes stared at him, as if he'd suggested flying to Berlin. "Lieutenant, that's a suicide run. There's at least a squad of Krauts between here and there, maybe more." Murphy checked his carbine and counted his ammunition. 4 magazines, 2 grenades, and whatever he could scrounge from the farmhouse once he reached it. The Vosges Mountains had taught him to travel light and think fast, to make decisions based on what was actually happening rather than what the tactical manuals said should happen. In the forests of eastern France, doctrine was just another word for getting killed by the book. The sound of German voices grew more organized, more urgent. Murphy could hear them calling coordinates, preparing for what sounded like a coordinated assault on the American position. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of field-gray uniforms moving with purpose. These weren't the scattered defenders that intelligence had promised. This was a full patrol, well-equipped and positioned to cut off the entire American advance through this sector. "Kowalski, how's Jenkins?" Murphy asked their medic, who was crouched behind the tank's armored bulk, trying to stop bleeding that shouldn't be happening to a 19-year-old kid from Ohio. "He needs a aid station, Lieutenant. Soon." The medic's face was grim beneath the red cross painted on his helmet. "This cold ain't helping neither." Murphy looked at Jenkins, remembering how excited he'd been 3 weeks ago when he first joined the squad, full of questions about combat and eager to prove himself. Now he lay pale and quiet against the tank tracks, another casualty in a war that ground up boys and spit out ghosts. The letter from Murphy's sister seemed heavier in his pocket, all those careful words about normal life in a world where teenagers worried about school dances instead of arterial bleeding. The fog continued to lift, revealing the full scope of the German position. Machine gun nests in the tree line, riflemen positioned behind natural cover, and what looked like a mortar team setting up in a clearing beyond the farmhouse. They'd turned the crossroads into a killing field, waiting for the Americans to advance into their carefully prepared trap. It was good tactical thinking, the kind that won battles and filled cemeteries. Murphy crawled to the edge of the tank's protection and studied the ground between his position and the farmhouse. Shell craters provided some cover, and a stone wall ran part-way across the field. If he moved fast and kept low, he might make it to the house before the Germans could coordinate their fire. It was a long shot wrapped in a desperate hope, but it was the only shot they had. "Morrison?" Murphy called to the radio operator. Keep trying to raise somebody. Battalion, regiment, anybody with artillery support. We're gonna need all the help we can get." The young private nodded and returned to his radio, twisting dials and speaking into the handset with the patient desperation of someone trying to call for help in a foreign language. The static that came back sounded like the electronic equivalent of the winter wind that cut through the Vosges mountains, cold and empty and indifferent to human need. Murphy thought about the last letter he'd written to his family, sitting in a barn near Strasbourg while artillery rumbled in the distance. He'd tried to explain what it was like here in the mountains, the way the war had become a daily routine of movement and contact, of small objectives that mattered desperately to the men who had to take them and meant nothing to the people back home reading about grand strategy and newspaper headlines. Hayes crawled over to Murphy's position, his face serious. "Lieutenant, I've been thinking about what you said, about covering fire and such. You really mean to try for that house?" "I don't see another way," Murphy replied quietly. "We stay here. We're dead. We retreat. Jenkins dies, and maybe a lot more boys when they have to come back and take this same ground tomorrow." Hayes nodded slowly, the way old soldiers did when they recognized a truth they didn't like but couldn't argue with. In the distance, German voices continued their coordination, preparing for whatever was coming next. The war had its own rhythm here in the mountains. Periods of quiet, broken by sudden violence, moments of decision that could save or damn everyone involved. Murphy checked his watch. E0847 hours. Somewhere behind them, American units were depending on this crossroads being clear. Somewhere ahead, German positions were waiting to cut them to pieces. And here in between, 8 men and a disabled tank were about to find out which side of the equation they belonged on. Morrison's radio suddenly crackled to life with fragments of transmission from other units scattered across the Vosges mountains. Static-filled reports painted a picture of confusion and contact all along the American line. Charlie Company taking fire from request immediate artillery on, casualties mounting, need resupply. Murphy listened to the broken voices describing the same kind of desperate situation they faced here at the crossroads. The 3rd Infantry Division was spread thin across these frozen ridges, each unit fighting its own small war while trying to maintain some kind of coordinated advance toward the German border. It was the nature of mountain warfare. Every valley became its own battlefield, every ridge its own front line. "Got something, Lieutenant," Morrison reported, pressing the handset closer to his ear. "Sounds like Baker Company got hit hard about 2 miles east. They're falling back to secondary positions." The implications hit Murphy like cold wind through pine trees. If Baker Company was retreating, the German patrol at this crossroads wasn't just a local problem. It was part of a larger counterattack designed to roll up the entire American advance. The farmhouse they'd been ordered to take had just become the anchor point for holding this whole sector of the line. Hayes had moved to the Sherman's machine gun position and was checking the ammunition feed. 30 calibers got maybe 200 rounds, he reported quietly. Enough to keep their heads down for a few minutes, but not much more. Murphy studied the faces of his men, reading the mixture of fear and determination that had become familiar during their weeks in the mountains. They were good soldiers, seasoned by combat, but not yet broken by it. Thompson, the barman from Arkansas, was methodically cleaning his weapon despite the approaching danger. Santos, their assistant radio operator, was redistributing ammunition with the calm efficiency of someone who'd learned that staying busy kept panic at bay. The German voices in the tree line had grown more urgent, more coordinated. Murphy could distinguish between the sharp commands of an officer and the acknowledgements of enlisted men preparing for action. He'd been fighting Germans long enough to recognize the sound of a unit getting ready to move, the particular cadence of men checking weapons and confirming orders before an assault. Kowalski looked up from Jenkins, his medic's training warring with the reality of their situation. "Lieutenant, if we're going to move him, it's got to be soon. He's lost a lot of blood, and this cold. Murphy nodded, knowing that Jenkins represented the impossible equation that faced every small unit leader in combat. How to complete the mission while keeping your men alive. How to balance individual lives against larger tactical necessities. The manuals talked about acceptable losses and mission accomplishment, but they never mentioned what it felt like to see a teenager's life leaking away in the snow while enemy voices grew louder in the distance. Through his binoculars, Murphy could see movement in the farmhouse windows. The Germans had definitely established an observation post there, probably with radio communication to their larger units. If they held that position, they could direct artillery fire onto any American advance through this sector. The crossroads would become a killing field, and units like Baker Company would keep getting chopped up, trying to move through valleys commanded by German observers. "Thompson," Murphy called to his barman, "you see that stone wall running along the south side of the field?" "Yes, sir. Looks like it goes about halfway to the house. That's gonna be our lifeline. When Hayes opens up with the .30 caliber, you and Santos work your way along that wall. Keep the Krauts' heads down while I make my run." Thompson nodded, the calm acceptance of a man who'd survived Sicily and Italy by following orders and trusting his squad leader's judgment. But Murphy could see the question in his eyes. Was this courage, or was this madness? In the Vosges Mountains, the line between the two had become increasingly thin. Morrison suddenly sat up straighter, pressing the radio handset against his ear. "Lieutenant, I'm getting something from regiment. Sounds like they want to know our status." Murphy took the handset, hearing the distant voice of someone safe in a command post miles behind the front lines. The voice belonged to the world of maps and reports, of clean tactical symbols that moved across planning boards without bleeding or freezing or dying in foreign forests. "This is Zebra 6, Murphy spoke into the radio. "We're at the crossroads, taking fire from estimated squad-plus enemy force. Sherman disabled, 8 men effective, 1 casualty requiring evacuation." The response came back wrapped in static. "Zebra 6, maintain position until relieved. Do not, repeat, do not abandon that crossroads." Murphy stared at the radio handset, feeling the weight of orders given by men who couldn't see the machine gun nests or hear the German voices coordinating in the tree line. Maintain position. As if they had somewhere else to go, as if retreat was an option when Jenkins needed medical attention and enemy patrols were moving to cut off their escape routes. Hayes caught Murphy's eye and gestured toward the forest edge. German soldiers were visible now through the lifting fog, working their way into assault positions with the patient professionalism of veterans. Time was running out, and orders from headquarters wouldn't stop bullets or save Jenkins' life. Murphy handed the radio back to Morrison and checked his carbine one final time. The farmhouse sat 60 yards away across open ground, its stone walls offering the only real cover between here and the German lines. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only plan they had. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. At 0852 hours, Murphy started his run toward the farmhouse. The first 30 yards passed in a blur of rifle fire and controlled terror. Hayes had opened up with the Sherman's machine gun exactly on schedule, raking the German positions with steady bursts that forced the enemy to keep their heads down. Murphy moved from shell crater to stone wall to drainage ditch, always conscious of the German voices shouting coordinates somewhere behind the muzzle flashes that lit up the tree line. A bullet tore through his jacket sleeve, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. Another round knocked his helmet askew, the impact ringing in his ears like a struck bell. But somehow, impossibly, he reached the farmhouse cellar door just as Hayes's covering fire drew German attention back toward the disabled tank. Inside the house, Murphy found evidence of the family that had once lived here, photographs on the mantel showing a French farmer and his wife, children's toys scattered on the floor, a half-finished letter on the kitchen table. The war had swept through their lives like a winter storm, leaving only fragments and memories behind. Now, German equipment filled the rooms where a family had once eaten dinner and planned for harvest seasons that would never come. Murphy worked his way through the house room by room, clearing each space with the methodical patience that had kept him alive through Sicily and Italy. In the kitchen, he found a German radio still warm from recent use, its operator presumably somewhere outside coordinating the defense. The static-filled voices spoke of artillery support and reinforcement, of American positions being identified and targeted. From the second-floor windows, Murphy could see his squad's precarious position clearly. The Germans were moving to flank them, using the morning fog as cover for a coordinated assault that would overwhelm Hayes and the others within minutes. Thompson and Santos had made it to the stone wall, but they were pinned down by machine gun fire from at least 2 positions. Jenkins lay motionless beside the tank, whether unconscious or worse, Murphy couldn't tell from this distance. Murphy keyed the German radio and began speaking in the broken German he'd learned from prisoners and phrase books, reporting false coordinates and requesting artillery strikes on empty fields. Confusion spread through the enemy ranks as contradictory orders crackled over their communications. German voices argued with each other, trying to sort out the conflicting information while Murphy systematically destroyed their radio equipment and prepared to turn their command post against them. The firefight that followed lasted 3 hours, though time moved strangely during combat, stretching and compressing until minutes felt like hours, and hours passed like heartbeats. Murphy held the farmhouse alone for the first 60 minutes, using captured German ammunition and moving constantly between windows to create the illusion of multiple defenders. Every room became a fighting position, every doorway a potential ambush site. The stone walls that had sheltered a French farming family for generations now stopped German rifle fire and machine gun bursts. Murphy found himself thinking about the children who had once played in these rooms, wondering where they were now, and whether they would ever come home to find bullet holes in their bedroom walls. The war had made their house into a fortress, their dining room into a battlefield, their memories into casualties. When his squad finally fought their way to his position, they found him methodically destroying the last of the German radio equipment, while enemy bodies lay scattered in the rooms below. Thompson arrived first, his bar smoking from sustained fire, his eyes wide with something between admiration and disbelief. "Jesus, Lieutenant," Thompson breathed, staring at the tactical situation Murphy had created. "You took this whole place by yourself?" Murphy didn't answer immediately, still focused on the radio he was smashing with a German rifle butt. The voices coming through the static had been young, scared, talking about home and weather, and small concerns that sounded exactly like the conversations his own men had around foxhole fires. Destroying the equipment felt necessary. Destroying the humanity behind the voices felt like something else entirely. Hayes appeared in the doorway, his face grim with relief and exhaustion. "Krauts are pulling back, Lieutenant. Looks like they lost their coordination when you took out their command post." Through the farmhouse windows, Murphy could see German soldiers retreating into the deeper forest, their carefully planned assault broken by the loss of communication and the unexpected resistance from their former command position. The crossroads would remain in American hands, the route would stay open, and units like Baker Company would have a clear path forward when they regrouped for their next advance. But the cost was written in the rooms around them. Bullet holes in family photographs, blood on wooden floors, and the knowledge that taking this house had required Murphy to become something harder than the Texas farm boy who'd enlisted to serve his country. The Vosges Mountains had a way of changing men, turning citizens into soldiers and soldiers into something else entirely. Morrison appeared with the radio, reporting that reinforcements were finally moving up from the rear. Artillery support was available. Medical evacuation was en route, and the larger tactical situation was stabilizing. The crisis was over, the mission accomplished, and the paperwork would record it as a successful defense of a key position. Murphy sat on the farmhouse steps and stared at the dirt road that stretched into the distance, thinking about the German voices he'd heard on the radio and the American voices he'd saved by silencing them. The mathematics of war were brutal and simple, but the human cost was something the equations never quite captured. What the after-action report would never record was the 47 minutes Murphy spent alone in that farmhouse, holding a position that should have been impossible to defend. What it wouldn't mention was the German medic he'd found in the basement, treating wounded prisoners with the same careful attention Kowalski showed to American casualties. What it couldn't capture was the moment when Murphy had to decide whether the young German radio operator reaching for his weapon was a combatant or just another scared kid trying to survive a war he'd never chosen. The secret that Murphy would carry for the rest of his life wasn't about tactics or heroism. It was about the 3 seconds of hesitation when he'd seen his own fear reflected in enemy eyes, and the knowledge that the choice he'd made in those seconds had saved American lives while ending others. The citation would mention his extraordinary courage under fire and his tactical innovation in the face of overwhelming odds. But it would never mention the weight of pulling a trigger when the target looked like someone's younger brother. Hayes found him sitting on the farmhouse steps 20 minutes after the shooting stopped, staring at the letter from his sister that he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. The paper was torn from a bullet graze he hadn't even noticed during the fighting, and his sister's careful handwriting was stained with cordite residue and what might have been blood. "Lieutenant?" Hayes spoke quietly, the way men talk to each other after combat, when normal conversation felt inadequate. "Medical evacuation's here for Jenkins. Looks like he's gonna make it." Murphy nodded without looking up from the letter, reading words about home and weather and small-town news that seemed to belong to a different universe entirely. His sister had written about the church social and the wheat harvest, about neighbors asking when he might be coming home and whether he was getting enough to eat. She'd folded the letter with care, never imagining it would be read in a French farmhouse while German bodies grew cold in the rooms behind him. Thompson approached with a German rifle he'd found in the kitchen, its stock carved with initials and what looked like a hometown address. "Krauts left a lot of equipment behind, Lieutenant. Good weapons, plenty of ammunition, even found some rations that ain't half bad." Murphy looked at the carved initials, wondering about the German soldier who'd personalized his weapon with reminders of home. The war had taught him that enemy soldiers carried the same photographs and letters that filled American pockets, that they got scared and homesick and wrote to mothers who worried about sons fighting in foreign countries. Understanding that made killing them no less necessary, but it made living with it considerably harder. Morrison came around the corner of the farmhouse with the radio, his young face still pale from the morning's fighting. "Regiment wants a full report, Lieutenant. They're talking about putting you in for something big, maybe a Silver Star or higher." The idea of medals felt strange to Murphy, as if they were talking about someone else's actions instead of his own. What he'd done in the farmhouse hadn't felt heroic. It had felt inevitable, like the only choice available to someone who couldn't live with the alternative. The courage everyone would write about had been secondary to the simple mathematics of responsibility. 8 men depending on his decisions, and no acceptable outcome that involved letting them down. Kowalski appeared from behind the tank where he'd been treating Jenkins, his medic's bag stained with blood and his face showing the particular exhaustion that came from trying to fix what war broke in human bodies. "Jenkins is stable, Lieutenant. Gonna be a long recovery, but he's young and strong. Says he wants to thank you for getting him out of there." Murphy thought about Jenkins, 19 years old, and excited about his first real combat just 3 weeks ago. Now he'd be going home with scars and memories, with stories he might never tell, and dreams that would probably include the sound of German voices in dark forests. The war changed everyone it touched, but it changed the young men most of all, turning boys into veterans before they'd had time to finish becoming adults. The reinforcements that arrived at noon found the crossroads secure, and the German threat neutralized, exactly as the tactical plan had envisioned. Officers with clean uniforms and fresh maps surveyed the position, taking notes for reports that would describe the action in terms of objectives achieved and enemy forces dispersed. The farmhouse would be marked on new maps as a strong point, its tactical value confirmed by the morning's fighting. But Murphy knew that what had happened here would live on in ways the maps couldn't show. It would live in the dreams of the men who'd fought for this crossroads, in the memories of families whose sons would or wouldn't be coming home, in the quiet moments when veterans gathered and tried to explain experiences that had no adequate words. The real cost of holding this ground was measured in things that couldn't be quantified: trust, innocence, and the particular kind of loneliness that came from doing necessary things that changed you permanently. As the afternoon wore on and the tactical situation stabilized, Murphy found himself thinking about the German voices he'd heard on the radio, young men talking about home and fear, and the small concerns that occupied soldiers' minds between moments of violence. They'd been doing their duty just as he'd been doing his, following orders just as his squad had followed his. The difference wasn't in their courage or their dedication. The difference was in which side of the crossroads they'd chosen to defend. That evening, as his squad prepared to move out to new positions deeper in the Vosges Mountains, Murphy took one last look at the farmhouse that had become his temporary fortress. Somewhere, French farmers would eventually return to rebuild their home and replant their fields. They would find bullet holes in their walls and bloodstains on their floors, evidence of the war that had swept through their lives like a winter storm. Murphy folded his sister's torn letter carefully and placed it back in his jacket pocket next to the weight that never seemed to leave his chest. Tomorrow there would be another road, another objective, another chance to make impossible decisions with other men's lives hanging in the balance. The war would continue, and he would continue with it, carrying the memory of this farmhouse and the knowledge that heroism was just another word for doing what you couldn't live with, leaving undone. 3 hours after the fighting stopped, Captain Morrison, no relation to their radio operator, arrived with fresh orders and a clear view of what had happened at the crossroads. He surveyed the tactical situation with the practiced eye of a staff officer, taking notes that would become the official record of the morning's action. The disabled Sherman, the German equipment scattered around the farmhouse, the ammunition expenditures and casualty figures would all be reduced to clean paragraphs in a report that made everything sound inevitable and orderly. "Hell of a thing you did here, Murphy," the captain said, studying the farmhouse and the fields of fire Murphy had commanded from its windows. "Regiments already talking about a major decoration. This kind of action, taking on a full enemy patrol single-handed, that's the stuff they write about in the papers." Murphy listened to the captain's words and tried to reconcile them with his own memory of the morning. The fear that had made his hands shake while loading magazines, the desperate improvisation that had passed for tactics, the faces of young German soldiers who'd looked as scared as he felt. The heroic narrative was already taking shape, transforming messy reality into clean storylines, suitable for hometown newspapers and military citations. Hayes approached with the squad's final equipment check, his sergeant's efficiency masking whatever he thought about the morning's events. "Ready to move out when you are, Lieutenant." Morrison, our Morrison, got the radio working again, and Thompson's redistributed all the captured ammunition. Murphy nodded, thinking about how quickly the war moved from crisis to routine, from desperate fighting to administrative details. In an hour, they'd be marching toward another objective, another crossroads, another chance for someone to make impossible decisions under fire. The Vosges Mountains were full of such places, each one defended by men who thought they were fighting for the last piece of ground that mattered. As they prepared to leave the farmhouse, Murphy found himself thinking about the German medic he'd encountered in the basement, a young man not much older than Jenkins, who'd been treating wounded prisoners with careful attention to their injuries rather than their uniforms. The medic had raised his hands without resistance, his medical bag clearly marked with red crosses that transcended national boundaries. Murphy had pointed toward the American lines and said a single word: "Go." The medic had gathered his supplies and disappeared into the forest, carrying wounded men who would live because someone had decided that healing mattered more than killing, at least in that moment. The march back to regimental lines took them through terrain that looked different in afternoon light, less threatening now that they knew the German positions had been cleared. Other squads passed them going forward, fresh-faced replacements who studied Murphy's men with the mixture of curiosity and respect that veterans earned through survival. They would learn, Murphy thought, what the Vosges Mountains taught everyone who fought there, that courage was less about feeling brave than about doing necessary things when bravery failed entirely. Thompson fell into step beside Murphy as they walked, his bar slung across his shoulder and his face thoughtful. "Lieutenant, what you did back there at the house, how'd you know it would work?" Murphy considered the question, trying to find an honest answer that wouldn't sound like false modesty or misplaced heroism. "I didn't know, Thompson. I just knew what would happen if we didn't try something. That evening, in a barn converted to a temporary command post 5 miles behind the front lines, Murphy sat down to write the after-action report that would become the official record of the Crossroads fight. The forms asked for tactical details and ammunition expenditures, for casualty figures and enemy equipment captured. They had spaces for timestamps and coordinates, for unit designations and supporting fires received. What they didn't have was space for the weight of making life-and-death decisions for other men, or the knowledge that heroism was just fear pointed in the right direction. The citation, when it came through weeks later, described Murphy's extraordinary heroism and outstanding courage in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. It mentioned his tactical innovation and his dedication to mission accomplishment, his leadership under fire, and his commitment to the men under his command. The language was formal and precise, suitable for hometown newspapers and proud families who needed to believe their sons were serving something larger than themselves. But what the citation couldn't capture was the cost of carrying such memories, the way certain smells, cordite and diesel fuel and winter pine, could transport him back to that farmhouse years after the war ended. It couldn't describe the dreams that would come decades later, dreams filled with German voices on crackling radios and the faces of young men who'd been doing their duty just as he'd been doing his. The real weight of that morning in the Vosges Mountains wasn't in the tactical victory or the lives saved. It was in the knowledge that war turned good men into killers and somehow expected them to live with what they'd become. 20 years later, Murphy would return to France as a civilian, driving rental cars through countryside that had been rebuilt and replanted, where farms flourished again and children played in fields that had once been battlefields. He found the crossroads without difficulty. It was marked now with a small monument to the American units that had fought there. But the farmhouse had been completely rebuilt, its bullet-scarred stone walls replaced with modern construction that showed no trace of what had happened there during the winter of 1945. An elderly Frenchman working in the adjacent field recognized something in Murphy's face and approached with the careful courtesy that Europeans showed to visiting veterans. They talked briefly in broken French and English about the war and the weather, about how much the countryside had changed and how good it was to see peace return to these valleys. The farmer mentioned that his family had lived in the old house, that they'd returned after the war to find it damaged but not destroyed, and that they'd always wondered about the American soldier who'd held it against such odds. Murphy thanked the farmer and walked away without identifying himself, carrying the memory of that conversation back to a life in America where people knew him as a war hero and movie star, rather than as a young man who'd once sat in a French farmhouse and learned the true cost of doing what others couldn't. The legend would outlive the man, as legends always did, but the weight of what actually happened would stay with him until the end. The knowledge that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories that no citation could ever fully capture. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.